All right, it is Tuesday. I'm KMO. This is Out of My Head, the live stream from the studios of Falls Area Community Television. And it is just me tonight, no guests, so hit me up in the chat if there's anything you want me to talk about. For the most part, though, I'm going to be talking about Taiwan, I think, unless you have requests. But before we get to Taiwan, it is October, and October is two things for me. One, it is Sober October. You've probably heard about that. Which for me means no drinking beer at night and no smoking the devil's lettuce. And it's the devil's lettuce that's the more jarring transition to not be doing that. It really impacts my sleep. At least it did for the first week. I think I'm past that now. But every time I get on one of these sobriety binges, I have this expectation that I'm going to have this burst of like creative energy and inspiration, and that I'm going to be really diligent and organized. And it doesn't work just like that. You know, the impressive level of sloth that I have accumulated over the course of the pandemic is going to take more than that to shake off. But that brings us to item 2 there. October is also Inktober. This is the day, and if you would go to the laptop here, this is the month in which every day of the month there is a prompt. So we've had so far crystal, suit, vessel, knot, raven, spirit, fan, watch, pressure, pick, sour, and today's was stuck. And the thing is, you just draw something in ink. You can draw in pencil first if you want to, and then start in ink. But being, well, lazy, disorganized, and looking to just, crank something out every day, I just start with the ink. And this isn't a personal rule of mine, but I never start over. Just whatever I start drawing is what ends up on social media. I publish these things to both Instagram and Twitter. I get very little traction on Twitter for anything at all. So most people who see my Inktober stuff see it on Instagram. So why am I logged in here as Geb Earth? That ain't right. Oh, what's going on? Well, I don't have to be logged in as me to look at my stuff. So we'll just go to the KMO account here, and I'll show you what Inktober has brought. So the first day of the month, the prompt was crystal. So this is a Gelfling from the Dark Crystal. This is actually from Dark Crystal Age of Resistance. That's right. That's what they call the miniseries on Netflix. And they use the exact same technology that they made, they used to make the Dark Crystal back in the early 80s, just all puppets really. Not CGI, not much of it anyway. It looked great, had a lot of woke messaging in it, but it wasn't too objectionable. All right, the next day is suit. So spacesuit with a tie. Day 3. Blazing fast internet down here, let me tell you. Wow. I don't know if it's the local internet or if it's Instagram. Instagram, of course, being a Facebook company. So I suppose while we wait for it to load, here, I'm going to reload the page. We can talk about Facebook going down. By amazing coincidence, just the day after the 60 Minutes interview with, what's her name? The so-called whistleblower, whom, under the Obama administration in particular, Obama persecuted and prosecuted, or his administration did, more whistleblowers than any other president. So, Washington, D.C., and Democrats in particular do not necessarily venerate, worship, or even respect the human rights of people who bring, widespread attention to government malfeasance. But in this instance, it wasn't the government that was being tattled on, it was Facebook. And the Democrats had a use for that. So they really elevated, what was her name? Ms. Bauer? Was that her name? I remember it was an A-U-R sound in it. Anyway, this was the first day. The first two days of Inktober, I drew in the morning, and I spent some more time on it. And on day 3, I basically forgot until late in the evening, and it was time to just grab a pen and draw something quick. So the cue was vessel. So he's in a roughly indicated sailing vessel and thinking, oh crap, I almost forgot. Alrighty. How can I get this bigger? No, I don't want to heart it. I want to look at it. Looks like maybe I'm not going to be able to show you all the days. This one was pressure. Obviously, no reference used here. Oh, how did I get it before so I could look at the actual image, like the full screen image? Grrr. Oh well. Skip October. I will show you next week. Alrighty. So let's look at the world. Here's the world. Alrighty. So my attention these days is focused a lot on the Philippines for reasons that will be obvious to people who follow my work and know what I'm talking about. But lived in Japan twice, so Japan is large in my my mind's eye. But north of the Philippines here and southwest of Japan is this island, the island of Formosa. Much in the news of late. So, I forget who it was, but it was on NPR. I don't listen to much NPR, but every now and again I still do listen to my morning briefing or my flash briefing, which includes NPR headline news. And in the NPR headline news, in like a 30-second story on the tensions around the Taiwan Strait, the NPR announcer defined Taiwan as an island that most Americans couldn't find on a map. Well, if you're an American and you're watching this, Taiwan doesn't have a particularly distinctive shape, just kind of a bean shape, but Japan has a pretty distinctive shape, and it's right next to Korea. So these two together, if you were sailing southwest down through the Sea of Japan and you just kept on going straight, the first big landmass you're going to hit is Taiwan. So if you're ever called upon to identify Taiwan on a map, there it is. Southwest of Japan, just off the coast of mainland China, just north of the Philippines. So Taiwan, there's a government in Taiwan, and Taiwan for me, in terms of my personal experience, is a lot like Singapore. Singapore down here, in that I've been there, but only technically, in that I had a long layover there. I never left the airport. So I've spent hours in the Taipei airport and hours in the Singapore airport, but never been outside the airport. So really everything I know about these countries comes from the internet and, maybe a smattering of TV, but mostly the internet. Alrighty, so Taiwan, this is interesting. If you go to Wikipedia, Wikipedia describes Taiwan as a country, but almost nobody else describes Taiwan as a country. Even like the president of Taiwan doesn't think of Taiwan as a country. Taiwan is China, but it has a different government from the rest of China. And the rest of China, communist-controlled, CCP-controlled China, describes Taiwan as a wayward province, a renegade province, a province which is just kind of going its own way for the time being. It will be brought back into the fold sooner or later, by force or voluntarily. That's yet to be worked out. But, it's part of China. And even the United States agrees. The United Nations in 1971 agreed that, there's only one China, and it's the communist China. So you'd think maybe that Taiwan, there was communist China, and then some people there said, no, we don't want that. We're going to have a different style. We want to be a democracy, so we're going to go to Taiwan and set up a democracy. That's not how it happened. During World War II, well, lots of bad stuff happened in World War II, and much of it can be laid at the feet of the Japanese. The Japanese occupied Taiwan in World War II, and many other places in the Pacific here. And then after the war, there was a new Chinese government set up, and that government was the Republic of China, and that was the government for the whole of China, all of mainland China and Taiwan. But then a few years later, and I mean a handful of years later, there was the Communist Revolution, and the communists took over. They took over mainland China. So the government, the Republic of China, which used to govern all of China, suddenly was just governing Taiwan. But the Republic of China, the Taiwanese government, is actually older than the CCP and has been ruling longer than the CCP. But it wasn't a democracy until really recently. In fact, it wasn't until like the 80s and 90s that Taiwan transitioned from being a single-party, military, dictatorial state to being a multi-party democracy. And now they have different parties, but there's basically two factions. There's a green faction and a blue faction. And the green faction, in general, in the abstract, looking far into the future, would like to reunite with China, but not right now. And the blue faction, way off in the future, in the abstract, but certainly not right now, would like in Taiwan to be its own country. But pretty much everybody is in agreement that Taiwan is part of China. It is one country with two systems. But the whole one country, two systems thing, well, that brings to mind a little place over here you may have heard of. Hong Kong. Hong Kong at this resolution, or at this distance on the map, looks like it's just a part of mainland China. But there is a river, there is a waterway that separates it. So, it is, there's Hong Kong Island. It is an island. It used to be part of Britain. This was a British colony for a very long time. And then, when was it? I guess the late 80s, early 90s, the British decided to give it back. And at the time, China seemed to be liberalizing. The United States had recognized China in the 70s, as did most of the rest of the world. There was investment taking place to bring China, up to jumpstart its manufacturing and, to bring it up to what we know it to be today. That was just getting started. And there was this generally shared attitude that if you bring up their material standard of living, if you integrate them into the world economy, if you show them the value of, and the wealth building potential of capitalist activity, that liberalization and, the nice human side of, what we think of as liberal democracies would just evolve naturally. And it kind of looked like it was going that way for a while. And then along comes Xi Jinping. And he's been in office 8 years now, but he's been building his power for a lot longer than that. He was the son of a prominent member of the Communist Chinese Party who fell out of favor, and Xi Jinping himself, in his youth, got sent to the countryside to to be re-educated via hard labor. So he's seen the really brutal side of Chinese communist autocracy, but he still seems to embrace it. And so giving Hong Kong back to the Chinese looked like a good idea. To a lot of people, enough people that, it happened. But now, and there was the promise that, China is communist. Hong Kong, not only is it capitalist, it's a center of financial capitalism. It is a powerhouse of capital finance in Asia. That is kind of threatened now because the whole one country, two systems thing, China is reneging on that deal. And more autonomy is being taken away from Hong Kong. And the remaining, democratic institutions in Hong Kong are increasingly just sort of a shadow show. Just for appearances only, but in substance, it is going more and more toward the model of autocratic communist China. All right, so China, and more importantly, I guess in this instance, Xi Jinping wants to make substantial progress during his lifetime, during his rule, of bringing Taiwan back into the fold. He doesn't necessarily need it to come back entirely, but there needs to be demonstrable progress. And certainly by the 100th anniversary of the revolution, which is in what, 40, somebody in the chat tell me the year. There's nobody in the chat. I don't know, sometime in the 2040s, we're going to hit I guess it would be 2049. we're going to have the 100th anniversary of the Communist Revolution in China, and they would really like to have Taiwan back in the fold in every respect by then. And Xi Jinping himself and many other officials speaking on behalf of the CCP have said that Taiwan's coming back one way or the other, and we will not hesitate to use force and bring them back in by military invasion. And according to Peter Zion, the entire Chinese military is designed with that primary purpose, to invade Taiwan, to subdue it, and to rule it. And they just have to cross this body of water. I say just. Amphibious invasion of a country is about the hardest thing you can do. It's probably the second hardest thing you can be called upon to do militarily. The first hardest being, after you take it, to actually rule it and make the people who live there live the way you want them to, as the U.S. has discovered time and again in the war on terror. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. Yeah, you can send in the big planes and the big bombs and do the shock and the awe and make people lay down their weapons at first, but a year later, 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later, they're still not living the way you want them to. They're not living according to the model that you're presenting. They're not respecting the institutions that you have imposed on the population. The same could well be true with Taiwan. So I wasn't going to mention names, but and I'm not going to bring up the tweets, but there were a couple tweets or tweet interactions, tweet threads that really irritated me on this. Of course, they're both from the left. One is from Australia, Caitlin Johnstone, the America-hating Australian lefty personality. And I don't know what else to call her, really, because, she's not a reporter. She doesn't do investigative reporting. And, her just standard anti-American shtick doesn't rise to the level of analysis, And so she said something to the effect of, if you think that the world should risk getting into World War III to protect this dumb little island, then you should just shut up about everything forever. You don't count. Your opinions don't count. Just shut the F up. That really doesn't even deserve a rejoinder. But also, Michael Tracy, he was somebody that I think does rise to the level of a political analyst and even a reporter. And I thought he often gets misfairly treated by the left on Twitter. So, he's somebody that I'm, if not necessarily writing things in defense of, I'm certainly defending him in my mind from unfair attacks by Twitter. Let's zoom out here. You see this? The South China Sea. People who aren't familiar with geography but just assume this must be in China, right? Or right off the coast of China. Well, it does go right up to the coast of China, but it's also the body of water that defines this side of the Philippines, that defines this side of Malaysia and Brunei, that defines, this part of Malaysia over here, and Thailand and Vietnam. Most importantly, I would say Vietnam. The Vietnamese have been repelling Chinese invasions for 1,000 years. Their culture really is developed around the mode of repelling, evicting, resisting Chinese invaders. You go to as an American, you can go to Vietnam right now, and you'd think maybe they'd have some hard feelings about that whole Vietnam War thing. Nah, they're happy to have you. Did you bring money? They don't seem to bear much grudge against the Americans because that was just a tiny little break. And the French before them, just a tiny little break from a culture-defining 1,000-year struggle against Chinese invasion. So China has had thousands of years to piss off all of their neighbors, and they have a lot of them. Now, Japan has also pissed off a lot of people, but, Japan is a different story. We'll get to Japan in due course. All right. So China claims the South China Sea, all of it, all of this stuff that I'm circling right here, along the coast of Vietnam, along the coast of Malaysia, along the coast of Brunei, along the coast of the Philippines, up here to Taiwan. China says that all of this belongs to China. And why? Well, there's a lot of oil, there's a lot of natural gas, and there's a lot of fish swimming in those water. And China says that all of that falls into their exclusive economic zone. You can pass through here, but you better not linger. So the United States, and to really drive the point home, there are a lot of small outcroppings. I won't say islands, because an island has a specific term. An island has to be a body of land that is large enough to support a permanent population. So this big thing over here, Palawan, this is part of the Philippines. That's surely an island. I mean, that's a very big island. But a lot of these things, like Jackson Atoll here, these don't count as islands. Or Sabina Shoal. So these shoals, atolls, rocks, navigational hazards, they don't count as islands. But China has been bringing in loads and loads of cement and sand and building these things up and calling them islands and claiming that this is now Chinese territory. These new structures constitute new islands that are under Chinese rule. Therefore, China owns the water, around them and all of the resources in that water. So they've built these things up enough to have airstrips and deep water harbors and military facilities. And they're not alone. Vietnam has been doing the same thing. Why? Because China's doing it. Now, there is a United Nations law of the sea and a court that rules on matters like this. China is a party, a participant to that international, not legislative, but judicial body. And that judicial body ruled against them because over here, I'm not sure I can find it in real time, but just off the coast of the Philippines, there is a shoal, basically a submerged island. And China claimed that the Filipinos couldn't fish there anymore because that belonged to China, even though it's right off the coast of the Philippines. And the Philippines took them to court, and the court decided in favor of the Philippines, and China said, oh yeah, enforce it, motherfucker. They basically flouted the authority of the international law of the sea, which they themselves, they say they respect it, but when it rules against them, and China's not alone, the United States also ignores rulings against them in international judicial bodies. So, in all fairness, let's see. But in the South China Sea, last week, or at this point it might be the week before, a United States nuclear submarine ran into something underwater. We don't know what it was, but it hit something underwater. And 11 sailors were injured, and they steamed off to Guam to lick their wounds. Michael Tracy on Twitter said, a nuclear attack submarine is in these waters, an American nuclear attack submarine in the waters out in the South China Sea. Isn't this terrible? Actually, what he said was, can we even complain about this, or is this just the world we live in? Something to that effect. But then later on, he followed up with, well, how would Americans feel if there were a nuclear attack sub in the Gulf of Mexico, in international waters? So this is what bugs me about when leftists talk about anything, or liberals even, talk about anything that has to do with the military or armaments or weaponry. They just use the sound. The sound of a name to indicate things without doing any sort of research. It's like when liberals, and when I say liberal, I'm talking about cultural liberals here, not classical liberalism that believes in freedom of the press and private property and, personal autonomy. Not that kind of liberalism, but the more prejudicial sort of liberalism, that Rush Limbaugh would have talked about. So when liberals describe, say, an AR-15 as a machine gun, it's not a machine gun. Now, it does qualify as an assault rifle, and they love to use the word assault. So they don't call it a machine gun as much as they used to, but they just demonstrate their ignorance. When they make pronouncements, where people who follow these topics and understand these things, they just realize, oh my God, what is this person talking about? And thank God they don't have any power over me to enforce their ignorant notions. But a nuclear attack submarine. In the case of the USS Connecticut, it is, a Seawolf class submarine. There's only 3 of them. They were built near the end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union went away. These things are very expensive, and so there was supposed to be a great many of them, and only 3 got built. And at that point, the U.S. Navy said, 3's enough. But it's a nuclear attack sub in that it is a submarine meant to engage with other submarines. It is meant to attack. It is meant to engage in underwater combat with other submarines. What's nuclear about it is its power plant and its propulsion. It is not a platform for launching nuclear weapons at land-based targets. It does carry up to 50 Tomahawk missiles, which can strike, targets on land, but this carries conventional ordnance. It is not a nuclear attack sub in the sense that I think Michael Tracy was trying to imply. So and I say this a lot about liberals. I don't know if they're being dishonest or if they're just ignorant. I hope it's just ignorance. I hope that he just read those words, nuclear attack sub, and he just assumed that meant a submarine used to attack other countries with nuclear weapons. No. It has a motor that runs on electricity. That electricity is generated by a nuclear power plant on board the submarine. Now, let's go back to Australia. Australia had a deal with France to buy some submarines. But the French don't make nuclear-powered submarines. They make diesel-powered submarines. Now, if your attack sub is going to sneak around in the water, you want it to be quiet, right? Suppose you were going to have a conflict where you were going to be sneaking around in a car. You need the car to be quiet. Do you want a car? I mean, for stealth purposes, do you want an electric vehicle or do you want one that runs on diesel? It's not a hard concept. But again, I don't see this spelled out in news reports about the deal with the French to supply these diesel-powered submarines. The Americans went in and negotiated with Australia, and they're going to buy American nuclear-powered submarines instead of the French submarines. This has pissed the French off to no end. They're very angry about this. I think they take it as a humiliating blow to their reputation and their self-esteem, but also they're losing a lot of money on the deal. Submarines are expensive. But the United States, Australia, and New Zealand have a defense pact that goes back to the end of World War II, basically. But New Zealand kind of scuttled it when they said, well, New Zealand is a nuclear-free zone. United States, you cannot bring your nuclear-powered vessels into our waters. That kind of messed things up. Now, they did soften on that later, but at this point, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia have all entered into a new defense pact. And as part of that arrangement, the U.S. is going to be supplying Australia with nuclear subs. Now, Caitlin Johnstone, who I mentioned earlier, says that this defense pact is not to defend China against China, or not to defend Australia against China. The only reason Australia would enter into a defense pact with the United States is to protect Australia from the United States. Imagine the circumstances required for the United States to go to war against Australia. Think about that. One, there's no strategic advantage to it, really. Two, the United States is a former British colony. We have a cultural affinity with Great Britain. Australia is also a former British colony. They speak the same language as us. I've lived in Australia. It's pretty much like living in the United States, except they drive on the other side of the road. There's very little difference. And it was striking when I got to Australia, I had just spent the previous month in Thailand, which is very unlike the United States. So spending a month in Thailand, traveling around with a 2-year-old at the time, then arriving in Australia was like arriving home. It felt very comfortable, very welcoming, and is a very easy place for an American to get along and just feel at home. It's like going to Canada, except in Canada they drive on the correct side of the road. No, they drive on the same side of the road as we do in Canada. All right. Another thing about war. And I'm stealing from George Friedman here, who I'm going to read something from him in just a bit. In the current milieu, in the current moment, and when I say moment, I mean like the latter half of the 20th century, Great powers don't go to war with one another because it is disastrous. We all know it's disastrous. So we fight these little bullshit proxy wars. We arm rebels in some place, or we fund repressive regimes who are suppressing the rebels who are being armed by the other side. The United States and the Soviet Union, the latter half of the 20th century was defined by the anxiety about the potential of going to war with the Soviet Union because they had nuclear weapons, we had nuclear weapons, we had massively overbuilt our nuclear arsenals, we had delivery systems that could just fill the skies with intercontinental ballistic missiles and rain death on everybody. And thank goodness it never came to that. And something that George Friedman says was, there's talk of a new Cold War with China as if that would be a terrible thing. But if you look at the Cold War, it ended with a whimper, not a bang. It never broke out. So, the Cold War is actually a pretty good model to look to. If we're looking at the near future of relations between the United States and China, and it is defined by a Cold War that goes the same, traces basically the same trajectory as the Cold War with the Soviet Union, well, yay. That ended with the fall of the totalitarian Soviet regime and the emergence of, maybe not liberal utopias, but certainly something better and something less volatile, but also less repressive, something less likely to bully its neighbors. Again, not that Russia is perfect in that regard, but certainly better than the Soviet Union. So that wouldn't be, of all the possible futures, the possible ways that interactions between the U.S. and China could work out, a retracing of the Cold War trajectory is not the worst among them. But the United States could never invade and occupy China. We simply don't have the resources for it. What we're talking about here is the possibility that if China decides to send a bunch of ships and planes and troops across this body of water to occupy Taiwan and to throw down, destroy, disrupt, chase away, the democratically elected government here and incorporate China by force into the communist-controlled mainland China, the United States has an interest in preventing that. One big interest is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. Maybe not most, but a huge percentage of the chips, the computer chips that go into our cars, that go into our phones, that go into all kinds of consumer products, and crucial infrastructure is computerized now. Electrical grids, all kinds of medical equipment. We have integrated circuits in everything these days, and a huge amount of them are manufactured right here in Taiwan, at the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. The Taiwan, I'm going to call it TSM from here on out, that's their ticker symbol because it is a mouthful. TSM understands that if China invades, their manufacturing plant is a crown jewel of Taiwanese manufacturing. China doesn't want to destroy this. They want to take over and own it and, profit from it. But, to spite the U.S., if it looks like they couldn't hold the island, they might destroy that facility. TSM is building a new one in Arizona. I'm very glad to hear that. I am really kind of disgusted at the idea that the United States is dependent on chips that it doesn't make itself. We certainly could. There's nothing in Taiwan that we don't have in the United States, required to build chips or a chip manufacturing facility. But it's just been cheaper to outsource it. Okay, so Taiwan, as I say, the idea that it is and has always been this bastion of democracy, counterposed to the totalitarian communist China is simplistic and it's wrong. It was a single-party military dictatorship for decades, and it was only in the 80s and 90s that it transitioned into a multi-party democracy. But the U.S. commitment to Taiwan is from the period when it was a military dictatorship. Let's talk about Japan. Lots of people are angry at Japan for things that happened in World War II because the Japanese were absolute shits. in Korea, in China, in the Philippines, basically anywhere where they went and asserted control, they committed humanitarian crimes against humanity, atrocities, some of the worst things, like anything the Nazis did, you can find examples of the Japanese doing something worse. Except in Taiwan. Now, yeah, when the Japanese went into Taiwan, there were summary executions and people got tortured and stuff, but not on the scale of Korea or the Philippines or China. And in fact, in the 18th century, when basically the European colonial powers were carving up Asia, Japan said, we're not going to get colonized, we're going to be colonizers ourselves. And they went and they started, creating their own colonies. And one such Japanese colony was Taiwan. And to this day, for a lot of people, that period of Japanese colonial occupation of Taiwan is a golden age. This is a great time. Cultural ties between Japan and Taiwan are surprisingly good. Now, the United States maintains what it calls strategic ambiguity about Taiwan. We don't recognize them as a government, and we've never said, the United States has never declared that it will go to Taiwan's aid if China attacks. The American position on Taiwan strategically is ambiguous. So strategic ambiguity is the order of the day. Japan, being a key U.S. ally in this region, maintains that same strategic ambiguity. But even though the United States has never said we're coming to the aid of Taiwan should China try to invade, we do sell them a lot of weapons. What does that tell you? So think about all the places where the United States keeps troops overseas. Where do you think the U.S. has the most troops stationed? Is it in South Korea? Along the DMZ here? Is it in Germany? No, it's in Japan. But most of the troops that are in Japan are really down here. Where is it? In Okinawa. Right here. Now, check this out. This island chain, these are all Japanese islands. They go right almost to the coast of Taiwan. This island here, Ishigaki, let's zoom in a bit more. It's just about 100 miles from Taiwan. Japan is installing land to sea, and land to air missiles, a lot of missiles here in Ishigaki. Why? Is it to defend Japan? I mean, let's zoom out again. Japan is installing a lot of missiles here. Is that to defend Japan from attack by China or North Korea? Or is it to defend Taiwan against a potential invasion? So again, when it comes to military cooperation between Taiwan and the US or Taiwan and Japan, it's all unofficial. Because officially, everybody agrees Taiwan's not a country. We recognize the CCP as the only government of China, and Taiwan is part of China. Everybody says that, but then behind the scenes, they act very differently. So even if Caitlin Johnstone is right, and the United States is the devil incarnate, it can do no wrong, or it can do no right, I should say. And it's just salivating, waiting to invade and enslave not only, all of Asia, but Australia as well. Well, suppose you could wave a magic wand and take Japan, or take the United States out of the picture. Japan's military and Japan's navy is at least the equal of China's, and when it comes to navy, they're superior to China. Now, I was watching or listening to Scott Horton's podcast earlier today, and Scott Horton, while he's got the usual lefty talking points about the evil American empire, he's interviewed a lot of people and he knows a lot of stuff. He really knows his stuff. So even though I disagree with him, in certain areas, I certainly respect his knowledge, and I do like to listen to his podcast. And what was Scott Horton talking about? Oh, yes. He was talking about how the United States, through its just ineptitude, it uses force or the threats of force where it doesn't really make sense to do that. And, through this sort of blundering, overly aggressive, just reflexive stance, China and Russia are not natural allies. Even when they were both communist dictatorships, even in the days of the Soviet Union, it didn't take much to drive them apart. And in fact, in 72, was it? Henry Kissinger and then later President Richard Nixon visited China and swayed the Chinese away from their tenuous relationship with Russia and started to drive a wedge between them. They are not natural allies. But according to Scott Horton and others, the current U.S. ineptitude and blundering imperialism and blundering international aggression is driving China back into the arms of Russia. But what could Russia really do for China in a contest over Taiwan? And I want to talk about the concept of a world war. Caitlin Johnson was saying the United States is going to start a world war by defending Taiwan against Chinese invasion. Isn't that weird that China is the one doing the invasion, but it's the U.S. that starts a war? But would it really be a world war? I mean, yeah, the United States and Australia and the Philippines and South Korea and Japan would probably go to the aid of Taiwan and fight China. So it would be a coalition against China. But if China doesn't have anybody on their team, is it really a world war? Well, for it to be a world war, they would need to have another team member, and that team member would probably be Russia. But what can Russia do for them? What China would like Russia to do is to become the United States and buy as much Chinese stuff as the United States buys, because China is in this weird position where it's in this weird adversarial relationship with its primary customer. Without the United States buying all that, that Chinese stuff, the Chinese economy doesn't grow the way it's been growing. Well, Russia just doesn't have the money, it doesn't have the population, it doesn't have the consumer base to step in and be the United States for China. So China can't really afford to divorce the United States. But suppose there was a conflict. Well, where's the Russian Navy? The Russian Navy's all up in here. What, are they going to sail all the way around, down under Africa, come up around here, through the Strait of Malacca, and come up here? Like, along this first island chain, these are all U.S. allies. Is Russia's really going to come all that way to come here to participate and help China? No. Is Russia going to volunteer troops that are going to make a big difference? Like China, one of their big challenges is, scroll down, Taiwan doesn't have a lot of beachfront property. They've got a lot of cliffs. They've got a lot of places where it would be impossible to stage an amphibious landing. There's just a few places where they could possibly have an amphibious landing. Now, one thing China has been doing, they have been co-opting, or what's the word I'm looking for? Basically drawing into service, forcing into service lots of civilian vessels. So in a huge invasion, an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, yeah, there would be some armored troop transports carrying Chinese troops, but there would be a lot of fishing boats. There would be a lot of, just repurposed civilian vessels, which have thin hulls. They're not thickly armored vehicles. They could transport troops across, but these things would be very susceptible to mines in the water or unmanned underwater vehicles, all kinds of things that, an armored troop transport could conceivably plow through. These commandeered, pressed into service civilian vessels would have a much harder time. China's got plenty of people. They've got plenty of troops. The hard part, bringing in Russian troops isn't going to really help them. What they need is help getting their troops across this body of water. But even if they were to invade, and even if they were to occupy, conquer and occupy Taiwan for a time, well, this is where we get into the lessons that the United States has been teaching everybody else vicariously for the past couple of decades. Yeah, you can conquer a place militarily. It doesn't mean you can rule it. It doesn't make it yours. It doesn't mean that the people who live there are going to live the way you want them to live. All right, we're about out of time. So the one other thing I want to mention.
Actually, I just wanted to mention that your mouse wasn't showing up on the...
Okay. So apparently I've been circling around with a mouse trying to point things out to y'all, and I'm told it doesn't show up on screen. But this will be hard to find. One thing Kim Iverson was saying on Rising last week was one thing that China is doing, which is really provocative right now, is they're sending a constant stream of military aircraft into Taiwanese airspace. They're not attacking anything, they're just flying in. Well, Taiwan can either ignore that or they can respond to it. You know, if Chinese jets are flying into their airspace, they can scramble their own jets and go and not fight them, but, you know, meet them. Basically just demonstrate to China, yeah, we see you and we're here. Well, to do this continuously, you know, round the clock, all the time, puts wear and tear on the equipment, on the pilots. It's just really hard, you know, to maintain that constant meeting of the Chinese in Taiwanese airspace. So, you know, what do? Do you run down your equipment and your pilots constantly, you know, answering this Chinese challenge, or do you just ignore it? Well, what Kim Iverson was pointing out was that those jets are not flying, you know, from the mainland over here to Taiwan. They're flying down this way. There's this corridor. Oh, okay, you can't see it, but here. From here to here. There's this corridor which is just in the extreme southwest of Taiwanese airspace, and it's not even really Taiwanese airspace. It's just a strategic area that is defined by the United States, not by Taiwan. And you know, I think by that she meant to say that really this constant stream of Chinese military aircraft, it doesn't constitute the threat to Taiwan that, you know, certain hawkish types in the U.S. would present it as. But what there is, those jets are heading toward this island. Now it says islands. It's really this circular atoll, but most of this is underwater. Let's go a little closer. This is part of Taiwan. And really all of this is underwater atoll. This is the only bit that's above the water. There is an airstrip here. Nobody lives here full time. But this is a popular tourist destination. It's a beautiful place. But it is part of Taiwan. There are lots, you know, we think of Taiwan as being this island over here, but there are lots of other little islands, and these are all administered by the Taiwanese government. And even some islands very close to the Chinese mainland. Before China invades Taiwan, you know, before they go for the big target, they're probably going to pick off the smaller things. And Pratas Island over here is one such target. You know, it's got an airstrip, it has some strategic significance, and this seems to be the attention, you know, or the focal point of these constant Chinese incursions into Taiwanese airspace. Alrighty, how are we doing here? All right. About 7 minutes. So I'm going to read something from George Friedman. But before I do, I just want to reiterate. The United States does not want to go to war with China. China does not want to go to war with the United States. That is a lose-lose scenario. That, I mean, even if we think it's going to be contained to the Taiwan Strait, once the shooting starts, you don't know how the conflict will escalate, where it will go, where unintended consequences will pop up. We just don't want that. Nobody wants that. But again, major powers don't fight each other in this technological age. It is disastrous. That's just not how we do things anymore. But I agree, it is something to be avoided. It is a worst case scenario. And whether or not Russia gets involved and makes it an official world war, or if it's just everybody against China, it is a situation to be avoided. All right, now, as I mentioned, Taiwan is a democratic society. They respect human rights. They respect individual liberty. You can go and open a business there. You know, if you live there, you can open a business and go as far as your God-given talents will take you, as, you know, Barack Obama might have said. But the U.S. commitment to Taiwan was originally forged in a time when Taiwan was not a nice, liberal democracy like it is today. So George Friedman writes, this is a little over a year ago he wrote this. So this is not in response to the current tensions, but this is an ongoing situation. On August 17th, 1982, again, Taiwan, not a democracy at this time. On August 17th, 1982, U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz sent a memo via an American diplomat to the Taiwanese government. On Monday, just over 38 years later, the memo was declassified. Its contents were secret in that they were not publicly available, but the gist has been well known for some time. These points had to be part of U.S. relations with Taiwan and China because without them, U.S. policy toward Taiwan and China made no sense. The decision to make public a document after nearly 40 years comes at a time of rising tensions, military drills, and Chinese threats in the Taiwan Strait, and is meant to stave off more escalation by clarifying its position. The memo outlines the following: that the U.S. has not agreed to set aside a date for ending arms sales to Taiwan, that the U.S. has not agreed to consult with China on arms sales to Taiwan, that the U.S. would not play a mediation role between Taipei and Beijing, that the U.S. had not agreed to revise the Taiwan Relations Act, that the U.S. had not altered its position regarding sovereignty over Taiwan, that the U.S. would not exert pressure on Taiwan to enter into negotiations with the People's Republic of China. In other words, the United States was not prepared in any substantial way to abandon Taiwan, and by releasing the memo, Washington confirmed that position it has held since 1982 has remained in place, and that China should understand as much. The original context of the memo had to do with Richard Nixon's visit to China, a groundbreaking trip born of mutual concern. Russian-Chinese relations were bad after the bloody conflict on the Ussuri River. China was afraid that the Soviets could defeat it. Meanwhile, the U.S., emerging bloodied from Vietnam, had weakened its position in Western Europe and feared the Soviets might take advantage of this opening. By restoring ties with the Chinese, the United States balanced this threat and opened a new threat against the Soviets if both attacked simultaneously. It made no ideological sense, but perfect geopolitical sense. Yet, it left open the status of Taiwan. The Chinese insisted that Taiwan was part of China, and Nixon agreed with them in principle, so long as it was understood that it meant nothing in practice. The Soviet Union was the central issue. By the 1980s, the Soviets were weakening a bit. The Chinese were increasing their power, and the Taiwan issue became more important. Ronald Reagan, of course, wouldn't budge, so the memo, which was and remains the U.S. policy on China, slammed shut the door on modifying its Taiwan policy. It may not have explicitly said that the U.S. would intervene if China invaded Taiwan, but it left little to the imagination. U.S.-China relations have since deteriorated, and China has raised the possibility of invasion in various ways. Releasing this memo at this time does not surprise China, but does affirm that any Chinese move must take into account a U.S. intervention. Unlike many China watchers, the Chinese themselves know that an amphibious assault on Taiwan, armed as it is with U.S. aircraft, submarines, and missile defense batteries, would likely fail, and that failure would vastly weaken their pretense of being a power on par with the United States. The memo itself didn't deter a Chinese invasion at the time. The U.S. alliance structure was such that that would have been a bad idea anyway. Beijing may see the reclamation of Taiwan as inevitable, but the inescapable reality of war is that you can lose, which is a non-starter for China. The U.S. may have taken a defensive posture on Taiwan, but it's an inflexible defensive posture. Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Australia, and the rest of Southeast Asia may have reason to doubt U.S. commitments in the future, but for now, the alliance remains very much intact. By releasing the memo, Washington is making it clear that nothing has changed. All right. So, what's going on in the media? I mean, I don't have time to dig into this in great detail, but why all the fear about China? Why all the fear about the U.S., coming to Taiwan's aid and sparking a larger conflict? China, I think it was the president of Taiwan, or maybe it was a think tank in Taiwan, but somebody recently released a statement saying, and it was supposed to be alarmist, that the Chinese military might be ready to invade Taiwan as early as 2025. Well, it's 2021. It's not happening tomorrow. So what's going on in the media right now? Why all of this attention to this issue? Why all of this fear-mongering? The media's got to have us afraid of something, and I think COVID is wearing thin. I mean, it's been wearing thin for a long time. But, part of the U.S. media's or corporate media's job role is to keep us anxious, is to keep us uptight, worried about something very bad happening very soon. The United States is not going to war with China. Certainly not soon. And if I were a betting man, I would say never. I think the U.S. and China will never get into an open conflict. Now, what's an open conflict? I mean, has China been in an open conflict with India recently? Chinese soldiers and Indian soldiers fought each other, but like with bricks and bats and sticks and things. It was a brawl more than it was, combat. Are they at war? No. Are they friendly? No. Will they be at war? I doubt it. It would be, the Himalayas separate India from China. It would be really hard to fight a war across that boundary. And why would they want to, really? I mean, that's just not how we do war anymore, War is more about, for the United States, it is about having global strike capability, but the U.S. has demonstrated over the last 20 years that we simply cannot roll in through sheer military might and set up another country the way we want it to act. It just doesn't work. And these are weak countries to start with, Iraq, Afghanistan. The U.S. cannot invade China, take it over, and make it do as we wish. And the reverse is also true. I mean, imagine any country or any coalition of countries trying to occupy the United States. We have so many guns and so many people who fetishize owning guns, maintaining guns, keeping secret stockpiles of guns, training with their neighbors and their drinking buddies for fantasy warfare. I mean, it would be an absolute nightmare. I mean, I think that the movie Red Dawn really understates the case as to how difficult it would be to occupy the United States. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. Have a good evening. Talk to you soon.